Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to the first From Slavery to Freedom Lab Distinguished Lecture. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the lab. My name is Lamont Edu. I'm an associate professor of romance studies. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of my co-directors, Jasmine Nicole Cobb and Rick Powell, and also the director of the FHI, Ranji Khanna. So we are really excited to have in our midst today someone who actually does not need any introduction because he is just amazing. His work has inspired us and taught us for years, for decades, and will continue to do so for many, many more. Dr. Lewis Gordon will be presenting today on enslavement, decolonization, and freedom. I'm going to read a very brief bio, but I will be very short because I know we are all very excited to hear from him. Dr. Lewis Gordon is professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at UConn Storrs, honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, honorary professor in the unit for the humanities at Rhodes University, South Africa, and distinguished scholar at the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of West Indies, Mona. He co-edits the Journal of Philosophy and Global Affairs, the Rowman Little and Littlefield book series Global Critical Caribbean Thought, and the Routledge India book series Academics, Politics, and Society in the Post-COVID World. He is the author of many books. We would be here all day naming his many, many publications. He is the author of the most recently published Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization that was published in 2021, and The Fear of Black Consciousness, which he will be lecturing from today as well, in 2022. And in the UK, the Penguin Books coming out in 2022. That is also coming out in German translation. So he is this year's recipient of the Eminent Scholar Award from the Global Development Studies Division of the International Studies Association. We are tremendously honored to have Dr. Gordon with us, and I'd like to welcome him not only to the lab, but to Duke, and we are thankful to have you amongst us and to learn from you. Without further ado, Dr. Lewis Gordon, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamont. I do. Lamont, it's such a pleasure to see you, to meet some of the students, Courtney, Barbara, many others. But before I begin a formal presentation, let me just quickly, some of you know I'm a musician, right? Oh, wow, Anthony's great. That's a little 6/8 pattern. I had the joy of jamming with some Ethiopian musicians in the Netherlands this summer, and the audience was asking, but it's interesting when you do the 6/8 pattern. It's a good way to also invoke ancestors. It's striking when we think about ancestors, mainly because ancestors only make sense if they're descendants. And we're living in very strange times, mainly because right now a lot of power in the world is in the hands of people who have no regard for ancestors, but also no regard for descendants. Such people, their mentality is their death is the proverbial end of the world. And how do you reason with people who think their individual death is the end of the world? I mean, when we look at the crises we're dealing with today, how can we even reach such people? I was speaking with a reporter this morning, and she was asking me about why are certain things happening now? When we're talking about racism, she was talking about racism, anti-Semitism. There's also the radicalization. There's contemporary enslavement. When we think of all the things through to ecological disasters, and we think about the authoritarian rulers that are beginning to have certain prominence. And I'd said to her, when we look at the world right now, most of the problems we're dealing with are human created. Yet at the same time, there are people who, when they face a situation like that, they almost want to go back to the womb. And right? And it's interesting. There are many kinds of conservatism, but there are two that are particularly evident today. One of them, and Simone de Beauvoir talked about this beautifully in some of her writings, particularly in The Ethics of Ambiguity, but one of them is this kind of safety people imagine, that there was a time when things were right, when everybody had it right, everybody was safe. But it's really a metaphor for the womb. And let's face it, the womb's nice. I mean, you got central heating, you got a good soundtrack. In fact, your introduction to reality is your mother's heartbeat. A lot of us don't realize our introduction into language, into speech, is that beat. And sure, it's tactile, people touch the belly and so forth, but the bottom line is good, but we know we get pushed out. And then there's another bunch who imagine when you're thrown out, there's this situation of perpetual insecurity. And so they want to have somebody who protect them. They want the safety. And unfortunately, in patriarchal societies, it means fathers. And particularly this country is obsessed with fathers. What's up with this founding fathers stuff? I mean, there were no women around. There's fathers this, fathers that, and it's such an obsession that in psychoanalytical terms, it becomes this notion that whether you have a good father or a bad father is irrelevant. And we know this if we think back to 2016 when there were people saying, if they don't have Bernie, they'll go Trump. The idea was you can have the loving father, you can have the bad father, but they're both fathers, which meant, of course, Hillary Clinton did not stand a chance. And as we see with this father obsession, what is it about these fathers? Of course, the idea is that if they're strong, they protect you. And so if people become obsessed with protection, they begin to seek these things out. Leaders who promise things they can't deliver, except for supposed strength. And Beauvoir really tapped into it well, because we all know this. When you're a kid and your parents piss you off, you say all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, they appear to you like gods. And the thing about gods is they have power. They can make things happen. They can protect you. And so you're thinking, adults are gods. But I was just having a wonderful conversation on this thing that happens to all of us, if we make it to this point, and it's called adolescence. And there's a reason adolescence is so tumultuous. Because you see, in adolescence, you discover your parents are not gods. You begin to take on responsibility, and you begin to learn that not only they're not gods, but it turns out that your parents, all that time where you were putting up with their stuff because of the premise that they can protect you, the truth is they couldn't protect you. And the reason they couldn't protect you is because as you grow into adulthood, you begin to learn you can't even protect yourself. They could not even protect themselves. And this leads to a profound existential crisis, a form of anger even. And Beauvoir noticed this very well, but it's not only she. Surya Aurobindo in India noticed this. Kaiji Nishitani in Japan noticed this. Frederick Douglass noticed this. Anna Julia Cooper noticed this. And what that is, of course, is that, you see, we human beings individually, just individually, are not gods. which means, as Freud said very beautifully, we create prosthetic gods. And among them is culture, language, signs, symbols, sociality. Power for us is what we produce in the human world. However, some people conclude, yeah, but it wouldn't be bad to have a god around now and then. And they go seek demigods. And so in that, the rationalization emerges for a past that was either like the womb or the father who can protect you. But then there are those who say, wait a minute, this is just prolonging our childhood. Adult life is also about us understanding that there was never perfect human existence, and that it was always up to us to take on the challenge of making things better. So when we look at the ancestors and we don't fetishize them, but we understand them in their humanity, we begin to understand our relationship to them. For instance, we're in this space where there was a profound ancestor, John Hope Franklin. I had the good fortune of meeting him. And he is connected to some of the things I'll talk about in a rather profound way. Because one of the things that struck me when I met him, and not only him, but there's so many others, it's funny when you're connected to people in the past. Because when I was a child, I had the good fortune of my great-grandparents being alive and my great-great-grandparents. And my great-grandfather lived to be 110. So, yeah. So, and he died in 1977. So you could imagine speaking to somebody who can have that connection to the past. And, and I remember just sitting on his lap as we would talk as the sun would go down. I remember, and by the time, and what's also striking, by the time I got to know him, he was blind. Okay, he had glaucoma, and then went blind. So my communication with him was with words and touch. So to this day, I still feel his hands on my face, what it is to have that. I remember his smell, because you talked so close, And with that connection, of course, you begin to have a sense that there's a profound responsibility that you can have if you make that transition into understanding your obligations for generations to come. There are special people all over the world, and there are times when I come to Duke, some of them have written me letters. They're on sabbaticals, they're away, like Walter Mignolo. There are people like Sandy Darity, Winema, Lubiano. The list goes on. My former student, Claudia Milian. There are people all the way through. And then there's this interesting community here, for instance, with Chapel Hill, the Box Hills, for instance, Bernie. And others, there are folks around. I even have nieces and cousins in the area. I spent this morning with my uncle Anthony, Lorenzo Solomon, and we sat down, and of course I'm not going to be in North Carolina without having some grits. And it was smooth, though I do like the gritty grits too. But at the same time, there are things that I'm going to talk about that I could put some things right away on the table, okay? Some of the things I could put on the table are, one, in a lot of my work, I am a vehement critic of the notion of nation states. I'm not against nations. I'm just against the idea that you put states with nations. Because once you put that power of states with nations, then you have people who belong and people who don't. You produce illegal or illicit people. We, humanity, should be beyond nation states. And there are lots of other things, too, that I take the position on that I'll talk about. And some of them are going to be fundamentally against idolatry and also there are ways in which we talk about ourselves as human beings that are so skewed because we're not really talking about human beings. We're talking about things. And when we thingify, sometimes you could signify by thingifying, we actually erase the humanity of others. So the topic is on enslavement, decolonization, and freedom. And the context of talking about it is Africana philosophy, Africana existentialism. But when I say this, I don't mean it as a closed idea. One of the things about when we think of Africana anything is we already know there was no reason for people to have called themselves Africana except for very specific historical events. But those historical events do lead to important interrogations, questions that we should ask. And among those questions we should ask, they are very straightforwardly. One, the historical events that created Euro-modern peoples, because even in Europe, there were not historically reasons for people to call themselves Europeans, whites, or anything like that. But the events that led to them were events such as colonialism, enslavement, and the rise of Euro-modern capitalism. And this is what changed, profoundly changed people who were, for instance, Xhosa, or people who were Telensi, or people who were Fanti, or people who were Wolof, or the list goes on, Fuladi. Fuladi, by the way, the Fuladi people were the largest group who were enslaved and brought over here. And a long list, but not only there. The truth is people are just being stolen everywhere, all over the African continent. There were people from South Asia. But these transitions generated a situation in which people had to ask some very crucial questions. And one of them is, well, what is it to be a human being anyway? Okay? Enslavement of people, the exploitation of people, the domination of people, led to a situation where there were people being told they were not people. Okay? And if you think about it, if somebody walks up to you and say, yo, you are not a human being, many of you would say, what the hell are you talking about? I'm as human as you are. But if you were to say I'm as human as you are, you would have lost. Because you would have made the person who challenged your humanity the standard. Should we make people who are racist, sexist, homophobic, classist, and the long list of ists the standard? So you may say, okay, I'm going to be a standard. But of course, the question is, well, what gives you the right to be the standard? And after a while, you begin to realize, wait a minute, let's interrogate standards. So you get that first question, and in those historical events, that's the philosophical anthropological question. It's the what in the world is a human being question, okay? But then there are other questions that are connected, because if these questions are going to be generated out of enslavement, colonization, etc., then clearly these are circumstances that militate against liberty and freedom. And you notice I say liberty and freedom. A big problem, particularly in the United States, is we conflate the two. But liberty and freedom are not identical. And then, if we continue, we begin to realize, oh, wait a minute, if we're going to interrogate the standards, then we're going to have to address our justificatory practices. How do we justify ourselves? And this becomes even more acute because the practices of justification were wielded in the interest of dehumanization. Every negative, oppressive thing we can talk about, from racism to sexism, all the way through, whether we use homophobia, classism, etc., has had some form of scientific rationalization. And once we understand, especially because this is a university context, we, whether we like it or not, are priests and priestesses. We're priests and priestesses of reason and rationality. And in that context, what do we say to people when Our exemplars have used resources of rationality for practices of dehumanization. That creates a justificatory crisis. And that's a crisis in which even justification itself is in need of justification. That's how radical it is. And then there's the other one. There's the redemption issue. And this is a very human phenomenon. People are always looking to be redeemed. And this is something that we see all over the place. Redemptive narratives are linked to justificatory narratives. But as we bring all those together, those are among the elements that inform African diasporic thought, not exclusively, but they are central themes. And because those are central themes, it makes absolute sense that a center like this should have a conversation with that approach. So, I'm going to talk about them, and I'm talking about them in the context of, I wrote a book last year called Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, which obviously addresses the research of this lab, this center, and many of you in this room. But I also wrote a book this year called Fear of Black Consciousness. And it's interesting when people, hear the word, see the word fear and Black consciousness together. But I gotta tell you, it gets even worse. Because when they dig into the book, they also see an unapologetic articulation of bringing together the words black and the word power. And this is really, really something crucial to think about in the context, particularly not of this country, but countries like Brazil, countries like India, all the way through to countries like the UK, just simply put globally, okay? And while I'm not going to talk entirely about my book, I'm going to talk about the ideas. You can see elaborations of these themes there. And you see I have a book in here, and usually when you're talking, you bring your book, but I had to bring this book. Okay, this is an amazing book by Margaret Burnham, okay? And Margaret Burnham, she wrote a book called By Hands Now Known. Now, everything she writes in this book, I know, I talk about in Fear of Black Consciousness, but what's crucial is methodologically, she brings out the empirical research when I'm making the critical claims that I make in this book, or our colleague here who did Slavery on Scene, Lamont Idu. In fact, I got to tell you, I have had the pleasure of teaching that book. I teach a course called Race in the Formation of Human Sciences. And when I teach this course, when you hear the term race in the formation of human sciences, people think, what do you mean race in the formation of human sciences? Because what we're used to thinking is we have the sciences, we have the social sciences, the natural sciences, et cetera, and we apply them to the study of phenomena such as race. But what that course begins with as an hypothesis, which is not actually an hypothesis, but I pose it as an hypothesis because I want the students to be critical. The hypothesis is, what if, just what if, it was actually race that produced the Euromodern human sciences? Just what if? And they're thinking, well, it's an interesting hypothesis. And in that course, we read in the first part of it just primary sources, right? Primary sources all the way from the 8th century through all the way to the 19th century. But I got to tell you, by week 3, oh man, by week 3, students are coming in the classroom like, they're like, damn, what'd you do to my heroes? I mean, in some cases, their eyes are red. And this is just reading the material. And this is something you should bear in mind because there are many people who know this. For instance, right now, there are people who are attacking critical race theory, and they don't know what the hell. They're really talking about actually the history of race. They're not talking about critical race theory. But there's a thing I have to say. I was at a meeting once in the Netherlands, and among them was the Jamaican historian Sir Hilary Beckles. And there were a variety of other historians who do historical work on enslavement, okay? And you notice I say enslavement. The problem when we say slavery, we make it so abstract, it floats superstructurally. But when you say enslavement, you understand there are actors. There are people doing something. People are enslaved by people who enslave them. And one of the things that Hilary Beckles brought up that was rather profound was, and all of the historians agreed with him, he said that when he went through the archives, and perhaps Lamont would attest to this too, when you go through reading the first person sources, the accounts, many of them were so traumatized they needed therapy. In fact, they were so traumatized that they also had a second layer of traumatization, which is, of course, they're professional scholars. And what do you do if you're a professional scholar? When to tell the truth, to report what you study, would be deemed unprofessional, would be deemed sensationalist. Most of the horrific things many of us study in the academy, in the books that are published when we teach, are actually the sanitized versions. So you could imagine how horrific the stories are. It's weird. It's a lot like a little black joke thing. We're in a restaurant today, and we were having some, and there was a drink that's supposed to have peppers in it. And, the waiter was really saying, be careful, And the woman who ordered it is Ghanaian. She said, oh, that's cool. And so she got it, and she drank it. She was like, what pepper? And I said, I think he was politely saying, it's what we call, among black folks, it's white hot. you know? And, but in a way, it tells you something, right? People talk about white fragility. But at the level of social theory and thought, of research, right? A lot of us face the question, right, of whether we're going to actually have the truth, the real pepper that's in there. Because, man, that stuff burns. And given our tolerance level, if it burns us, that gives you a sense of the gravity of the situation. So, first, enslavement. Now, one of the things about enslavement, I'm not going to get, because we only have a short time, but I'm just going to just outline each so we could have a conversation. If we start with enslavement, people often bring up the fact that slavery preceded the Euro-modern slave trade. People enslave people all over the world, right? And they usually, when they bring this up linked in with a particular anthropology. And it's the anthropology we should question. It's the human nature anthropology, okay? The problem with the human nature anthropology is that the human nature anthropology is fallacious because it imposes on the human world something that's not human, which is a nature. Because you see, the thing about what we call human is that the thing we call human is not a thing. It's a deviation from the realm of things. Indeed, the notion of existence, it just means ex, out, sistera, stand, to stand out. Although there have been hominins around for, some people say, 2 million years, the fact is there were many kinds of hominin, and by the time our species popped up, a whole lot of creative stuff was already going on. You may notice, for instance, when people talk about us and technology, I gave a lecture for Meta, and this was Meta Africa, which is rather unusual. And it was a very strange moment. The reason I agreed to do it was for Africa Day. And it was a strange moment. They want to know what they should be doing. And one of the things I said was, even though you're people who work in technology, y'all don't understand technology. And they were like, who's this arrogant black man telling us what we know? But you see, many of us don't understand technology. because we imagined there are us and there are technologies, and we use the technology. But there was never a time in which Homo sapiens did not have technology. There were many hominins who have already transformed the environment in such a way that we evolved in technology. We were always there. Hominins were using fire, building tools, doing creative art before there was even a Homo sapien. So to imagine we, our species, ever without technology is absurd. But one of the things we do when we separate ourselves from technology is we create the notion of instrumentality, things for use. And we, in that process, attempt to transform the technologies of creativity, which is what human beings, in effect, can be understood as, because we're in the present participle. Human beings, even though we use the word beings, it's actually human beings actively trying to be, you see? And when we try to collapse it into a technology, we're closing off the possibilities of that human being by making that human being into an instrument. And so the instrumentalization of human beings is part of the history of enslavement. But of course, throughout that history, that has created a situation in which there are human beings struggling against that, and that there's always been a creative struggle that has limited the capacity of what it is to be instrumentalized. However, when Euro-modern enslavement emerged, and when I talk about colonization, I'm going to talk about this. When I say modern, one of the fallacies is that we equate modern with European. That is part of the colonization of our mind. Because all modern means is to belong to the present. However, if one tries to distort the modern, then one conflates the Euro-modern and modern. So within the specific historical context of the Euro-modern, enslavement began to shift, and what emerged was the idea that there was something that can be brought in that could be recoded into the notion of the naturalization of the enslaved. And the thing that worked for that came from a peculiar conundrum. And I'm not the only person who noticed this. Sylvia Wynter noticed this, Hortense Spillers noticed this. There's so many who know this, okay? Because you see, the old term reza, today because of people using Spanish say raza, but reza is actually through Arabic that goes all the way back, actually to ancient Kemet in Egypt. That's connected to the notion of east to west and origins. But reza was originally onto Afro-Muslims and Jews. But the reza concept, which was a theo-naturalistic concept, right? The idea was Christians were within the sight of God. Those outside of the sight of God were reza, and they belonged among horses and dogs, etc. So already there's the dehumanization practice. Well, here's the problem. The philosophical rationalization of that practice was already embedded in concepts that you could find, say, from Aristotelianism, which put it in the framework of gender. And it was already fallacious, right? Because a lot of people didn't buy it, but there are people who sold it to us. And the idea was that women were basically undeveloped men. Now, when you think of a woman as an undeveloped man, that really gives a lot of weird readings on the female anatomy. And if you go read these texts, they really try to sell it. You know, they really try to sell it hard. However, once you now have taken to the seas and you've continued the logic of war and you're colonizing people to say that those people are undeveloped, now you have the conundrum. Because amidst them are people who are anatomically female and male. And so ironically, it is the colonization and enslavement of peoples outside of Christendom that began to produce the Europe we know, which is just the western peninsula of Asia. That's a whole other story. How do you really explain to people why Europe is called a continent? It makes absolutely no sense. Okay? And then, but in that framework, now it created a new category of people. And that category of people were basically, in a nutshell, European women. Because now you have to have white men and white women and the rest who are undeveloped. Now, within that framework, it meant something very crucial. And because we have limited time, I'm not going to go through all the details, but one of the things we should bear in mind is, it sucks to be enslaved. So enslavement usually, if you're going to rely upon the physical mechanisms of violence for enslavement, it's not going to be that effective. In fact, anybody who studies slavery, for instance, in this country knows that one of the most difficult things to get on plantations was fire insurance. All right? So African Americans in the room, all those people who sit self-righteously and say, we wouldn't put up with that, something's wrong with you. You didn't put up with it. Our ancestors didn't put up with it. We're having a rewritten history, a problematic history. But it's another thing that was really striking? And this boggles my mind. One of the biggest problems during slavery was poisoning. And it's always perplexed me. How are you going to humiliate people, slap them up, rape them, whip them, do all kinds of crap, and tell them, go cook my food? Now, I got to tell you, I cook. I'm like a serious cook. I know a lot about cooking, chemistry, all things. And this is crucial because I'd like you to rethink the understanding of enslavement through this story. Anybody, you have to now step back and rethink your understanding of the people who were enslaved. Now, there are many kinds of enslaved people, but I'm going to focus on Africans, okay? Because this also pertains to Asians who were enslaved. But I'm focusing on Africans right now. One of the things that needed to be done to make enslavement work, in a nutshell, is to get people to live lies, okay? That's why you see all this tenacious, narcissistic rage, especially against academics, because our job is to produce truth. Well, one of the lies is that the people who are enslaved from Africa were just walking in the bush. What are you doing? I'm just in the bush. All right? It's always struck me, right? All these weird mythological things that people think of, For instance, people used to always talk about finding lost tribes. And I always thought, what the hell is that? You picture the person cutting through the machete, move, and you see a bunch of people and say, what are you doing here? We lost. Yeah, what the hell is a lost tribe, right? Well, similarly, the stereotype is to look at enslaved Africans as exclusively brute labor. And I could give a whole lecture just on this issue. The people who are enslaved, remember, humanity has been in the African continent in different forms, different hominins for more than a million years, and our species, about 300,000, okay? What do you think the people are doing? And what the people are doing, if you understand them technologically, we're developing education, systems of learning, trial and error, all kinds of things. These people were skilled labor. They were physicians, they were architects, they were military people, the list is long, artists. You go down the full spectrum. People with legal analysis, spiritual leaders, long list. So they had knowledge. And one of the things if someone tells you to go in that food and cook your chicken, all you got to do is take some raw chicken and rub it up into the salad. You bring a cooked chicken out. How is it? The chicken's really good. You going to try some of the salad? Sure. So, yeah, these enslaved, particularly because they were women, they knew what they were doing. Good Lord, how did Bass's baby just drop dead? What? My stomach's hurting a little, right? So there was resistance, okay? When you understand this, right? But there are also all these other things. There's a reason places that had these enslaved people tended to prosper because they brought knowledge. You see? Inoculation that we talk about now, that was brought by enslaved people, okay? When we think of a lot of the techniques we use in making food edible, because a lot of these things did not develop in Europe. But of course, this leads to the fundamental premise. It's not just the violence. You have to convince people of the lie as a truth. You have to convince them of their inferiority, that they deserve to be enslaved. They themselves are ultimately, in their nature, slaves. And so enslavement had twin elements. It had the brutality, the absolute horrific brutality. But it also had, in religious language, a theodicy. A theodicy is when you argue for the goodness of God in an unjust world. And if you idolatrously make a people the gods, if you make a system the gods, then the only conclusion for the sufferers is not that the system is harming them, is that the system is good, there's something wrong with them. Du Bois knew this, which is why he talked about what it is to be people constructed as a problem instead of as people who face problems. And this rationalization takes many forms, but it also takes a form that Frantz Fanon observed. You know, a lot of people talk about Fanon a lot these days. And unfortunately, some people are talking about him in a really distorted way, the Afro-pessimists, because they say things like, the black is ontological, the black is not human, only whites are human, stuff like that. And then they use Fanon to argue this. But Fanon didn't say that. When Fanon, the title of the book, Black Skin, White Mass, people miss this. The book is basically arguing that Euro-modern colonialism and racism and its system of enslavement produced two rationalizations that affect us all. The first one is the notion that black people are ontologically sealed in our skin, black skin. As long as you're in black skin, there's nowhere else to go. You're epistemologically closed. And if you're epistemologically closed, you're not a human being. That's what he's saying, okay? Because to be a human being is to have possibility, you see? But why did he say white masks? And a lot of people misunderstood the book to be arguing that it was about black people wearing white masks. That is absolutely false. The white mask is the lie of the superiority of whiteness. Because whether you're black, brown, green, or whatever, we're talking about human beings. The notion of an intrinsic superiority of a human being is a lie. So it means in order to rationalize that lie, white people have to wear the mask. You see? And there are black people who get duped into believing that mask. And a lot of people who are white know this. When white people are among themselves, they're like, man, we stink like everybody else. All right? When white people are among white people, they know all their limitations, their flaws. You bring a black person in the room, a brown person, suddenly white people are acting like they're perfect. That lie of perfection is the white mask. So both are lies. Black skin and white mask are lies. And if you have a lie that says you're below humanity and a lie that says you're above humanity, where is humanity? And that's why Fanon in that book said, Euromodern society is an attempted murder of humanity. That is what the book is about. Okay? It's not the only thing, because he also, way ahead of me, he was also given a critique of Euromodern science constructed, because if you think as a psychiatrist, his job is to make his patient at home in the society. But Fanon noticed that if he tried to make a black person, or a black woman, as to be specific, feel at home in a racist, sexist society, then he's complicit with a racist, sexist system. His counsel is she is not at home. She is suffering precisely, and get this, precisely because she is healthy. The reason people keep telling us there's something wrong with us when we're pissed off is because they're afraid of the truth, because the system is designed to make us unhealthy. And so, if we understand that fundamental element, the philosophical anthropology of enslavement, but we're talking about racialized enslavement, is to create the rationalization of an intrinsic justice of enslavement and dehumanization. And in order to do that, it has to have, because this is where violence comes in, it must have systemic disempowerment of a people. You see? And what's really striking, what really bugs me out, is there are people who call themselves black liberationists and who are actually anti-power. But you know, many people don't talk about what power is. Power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. If you want to disempower people, you take away their access to the conditions. That is what enslavement and racism are about. That's what Jim Crow was. That's exactly what's happening in this country right now while they're systematically disenfranchising the black vote. It's to undercut the conditions of being able to act. And enslavement is to limit the options over which you can act. How much? Because you see, nobody can do anything without power. If I did not have arms, I couldn't hold up this book, okay? And if I don't have arms, I could use certain technologies to give me access to that book. You see, that's a condition of possibility. However, if we're talking about everybody in a room, but only some people, even though they can have their arms and their legs, if they have a whole system that will punish them if they touch this book, and other people will reward them if they touch it, the options are different, and power becomes different. So we all need power to live. However, some people use power to limit other people's capacity to live humane lives. That is what enslavement is about. It's the instrumentalizing of a people to the point where their power is only where their physical body can reach. But the human world is entirely about creating power beyond the physicality of our body. Culture, language, through which we have laws, through which we have systems of knowledge, could create a situation in which we in this room can reach people elsewhere without leaving this room. The film being made of the speech, but even beyond that, when you use your phones, why do we call them phones anymore? They're not phones. It's so weird. We have to catch up. It's like calling cars horseless carriages, you know? We'll catch up. But the point is, power, properly in the human world, is to be able to have an impact on reality without your physical body having to be there. And that's what institutions do. That's what politics does. That's what all the mechanisms, if we have access to them, do. But as we know, the reality, particularly in the history, and why I love this book, is she does it so beautifully. You see, if we use the US example, but it's also happening in India in terms of the situation around Dalits and Muslims, but it happens in many places, okay? It happens in Brazil and so forth. One of the things that disempowerment that's linked into the institutions of a society, right? One of the things they do is they create a lie, and in this society, the lie is called white civil society. Every black person knows that white civil society is not very civil. White civil society was a whole edifice to make it punishable by death to say I'm a human being as a black person. Today, there are people you love to use the word white privilege, and I argue against that. This is not about privilege. If you look at the things people assert as white privilege, there are things like access to health care, schools, clean water, fair treatment under a criminal justice system. You know, once you begin to interrogate all the things people call white privilege, you begin to realize, wait a minute. Aren't those things everyone should have? If everyone should have them, they're called rights. However, there is something in the history of this country that whites as a group had, and to some extent continue to have, and the right wing in this country are fighting to retrieve, and that is white license. A license, if you have a license, you can do something without accountability. In the popular cultures, James Bond could shoot people down and say, yo man, I got my license. See? I did it, but I have my license. Think about it. There are people who would lynch, massacre, cut open pregnant women's bodies and pose for a picture for postcards. This is no issue of trying to figure out who did it. There are so many cases. Right now, one of the biggest conundrums in this country is to study in an actual rigorous way, right? Crime. Because license means no crime was committed. The true figures, and often when people are really in hysteria about something, it's often projection. It means that's what they would do in that situation, or that's what they're doing. So a lot of this country's history about black people committing crime is because we know the truth. The truth is, one, white people commit a lot of crime. But two, if white people commit a lot of crime and life goes on, maybe a lot of crime isn't that bad. Right? Maybe some of the stuff about criminal justice system, you know, the prison industrial complex, maybe it's just not that. Maybe it's a small category of things we have to deal with. So when we see the link, we come now, and I'm going to move quickly, we come then to the question of this. Implicit in what distorts how we talk about enslavement is already a problematic metaphysics. It's a problematic metaphysics that you could look at people as substance, as things that can be realities unto themselves. But if we understand human beings as relationships, and this is a structuralist argument, then actually the relationships produce the meanings. And this is what Fanon was saying. When he says sociogenesis, he was saying we actually, in the production of meaning, are transforming who we are. And that's why if we think of ourselves also as technology, not users of it, but as it, we are involved in technologies of the production of what and who we are. In fact, one of the things I love about Lamont's book is he looked at sexual violence as a technology of enslavement. You see what I'm getting at? And this is where, by the way, when I make these points, I'm not saying white people don't have anything cool to say. So Foucault was really good on this when he talked about technologies of the self, okay? What we need to understand is how we function in our relationships to produce the worlds we live in. And that is also how we produce power, okay? So quickly, if you're going to talk about decolonization, you need to talk about colonization. But as we know, and this is one of the centers of talking about coloniality, but coloniality, and some would say neocoloniality, but whichever way you say it, the insight, which is from people, not only Fanon, but people in Haiti, like Antoine Fermat, or you could see this in the 19th century. There's so many others who understood this. But the basic insight is, the way we move from simply the brutality, the physical brutality of enslavement, into the logic of enslavement of the mind, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o would put it, is that we also have that with colonization, okay? Beyond the brutal fact of colonizing of people with material forces, one has to go through the legitimation of the colonization. And those legitimation practices have whole systems and orders of knowledge linked to them. And very briefly, because I'm just going to mention them, because I talk about them in these books. You could already find them. They usually take the form, the colonial practices of, one, the racial and ethnic misrepresentation of history. I've been talking about that throughout, okay? Two, the coloniality of norms, okay? Now, again, I can't elaborate here because we have a limited time, but a good example is even the way we talk about justice. We can actually talk about justice in such a way that paradoxically it produces injustice. We can have just injustice or unjust justice, precisely because if we take it out as a relationship with other norms, we will fail to see how it produces certain forms of harmful practices. What do I mean? Well, it is possible under the current way we talk about justice to have a so-called just society that is unhealthy. If you have a healthy society, it can be a healthy society that includes justice, but doesn't stop at justice. How can we say, right, that we're dealing, for instance, with the humanization of people when we are systematically producing an unhealthy society, okay? It's particularly acute in the pandemic because, a lot of people are taking the concept of breath very seriously these days, okay? And in addition to that, we need to deal with the market commodification of human reality, okay? Now, a good example of this is market commodification even affects markets. If you say markets in the plural, people are always talking about capitalism and say it's about markets. But capitalism isn't about markets. Capitalism is about business. Business and markets are not the same thing. In fact, historically, markets in the plural were very different. If you go to many societies, markets, for instance, a lot of markets were run by women. If you think about markets, why do people go to markets? Think about, for instance, here's an example. Think about malls. Malls have a collection of businesses, right? But right now, because of the pandemic, a lot of people don't go to malls the way they used to. But when people used to go to malls, it wasn't actually, most of the time, to buy something. It was to socialize, you see? And in many societies, people went to the market. In fact, even, I teach one of my courses where we begin with 4,000 years ago with a story of a person going to the market, okay? People went to the market to meet people, to get news, to find out what's going on, and they might buy something, or they might trade something, but it was a very human, social relationship. Capitalism says, cut it out. It's too human. You shift it, and you make the objective profit, and you try to reduce the human relationships as much as possible into instrumental ones, and then you create an abstraction. And the abstraction is not markets, it's an abstraction called the market. And the market functions exactly like the God. And if it functions that way, then the market has its rationalization identical to theodicy. In fact, people say, let the market figure it out. There are things where if you suffer, if you die, maybe that's what the market wants. Do you see where I'm going with this? And that kind of a market commodification happens not just by making business subordinate markets, but it happens at the level, we already know with enslavement, that's the market commodification of people. But it happens with knowledge. The market commodification of knowledge turns knowledge from truth, from reality, and simply into a business. And you already know this because all you got to do is look around the world today. even though the university came out of colonial project in Bologna, Italy. Prior to that, there were grand learning communities go back several thousand years. We don't have to do research and knowledge this way. But once we did, the center of it was the seminary. So it was to the point. This is about God. But then the arts and sciences pushed God to the periphery and became the center, right? Arts and sciences. But look, the arts and sciences are being pushed to the side, and you all know what the modern cathedral is in universities, the business school. The business school is the seminary of capitalism. And that's why business schools lie. Right? Business schools will say all kinds of things, but ultimately, and I won't get into the details here, but that's a whole other lecture. But the fundamental goal of it is the Theodician rationalization of the market. Okay? And so what's lost is the idea of social health, the goodness and life for people. Okay? And the others that I could connect here, and I can't develop right now, this leads to disciplinary decadence. Okay? But I could talk about it in question and answer. The short version of disciplinary decadence is a form of theodicy of knowledge in which one is insular to the discipline, treats it as ontological, and as a consequence, mere methodological application. When this happens, it means it's not interrogating its relationship to reality and truth, which is why a decadent study of enslavement doesn't actually study enslavement, but is actually rationalizing the legitimacy of the discipline, and they try to squeeze the reality of enslavement into the discipline rather than adjust it methodologically to the realities of enslavement and other human phenomena. This is something I call it disciplinary decadence, but there are others who have spotted it. Du Bois had spotted it. Fanon spotted it. Fanon spotted it. People in literature spotted it. Richard Wright spotted it. Anna Julia Cooper spotted it. Cheikh Anta Diop spotted it. Sylvia Wynter spotted it. They didn't call it that, but it is there, okay? And the idea is if you think relationally, then you realize that disciplines have to be communicative. And in that communicative practice, they realize that reality is always bigger than the discipline, which means there's humility when we actually practice our disciplines rigorously. And if we don't, it leads to the other one, solipsism. But we can talk about that in question and answer. So I'm going to conclude with this talking about freedom. And in the beginning, I said there's a distinction between liberty and freedom. Now, you may notice a lot of the ways I talk about these issues, I don't talk about them reductively. Reductively is the old methodological approach in which you're looking for a single essence to say what something is. But if the human world is not epistemologically closed, then with human reality, there's not a single essence. One has to deal with varieties of dependent variables interacting with one another. You see? So if you understand this, we'll begin to realize, first, let's start with liberation. The easy answer for that one is whatever's the negative force on your shoulder, get it off. Okay? You achieve liberty. Okay? Now, there are times some people get really annoyed when I say this. I remember there are several things that I say, and I've argued this in a South African context. One of the reductive rationalizations we have is moralization, moralism, okay? There are a lot of people in the academy today, but also in political activist groups who say they're political, but if you really interrogate, they're really arguing moralistic positions, okay? And the thing with moralism is that moralism seeks a kind of purity, but the human world isn't a world of purity. Once you're relational, you're no longer pure. And if you try to achieve purity, it means nobody's good enough. And after a while, you're in an identity relation with yourself. But the moment you compose yourself as a possibility to yourself, then there's a relation and you're not good enough. Which means, like old Yeller, you got to take yourself out back and end it. Okay? So I usually say, I don't give a damn that there are immoral people in the world. I give a damn that there are immoral people with power. You take them off my neck, which is not a small statement these days. I'm good. Now we could do something else. But if you think moralistically, once they're off your neck, you're obsessed that they exist. So you're locked into the logic of purification instead of spending time trying to build up something else. And the something else is a rather interesting issue. To think about the something else, think about Audre Lorde, okay? And I'm going to bring her up in two ways, okay? Everybody's heard the master's tools don't tear down the master's house, never did, never will. But what they miss is an important issue. You know the way I was just talking about enslavement in the beginning? The masters don't build squat. Enslaved people do. The tools, the ideas are not the masters. The masters, what she was talking about was a specific set of masters' tools, those that rationalize enslavement and degradation. But she never argued we lack tools. And in fact, when I'm in South Africa, all the time you'd hear, but not just there, lots of parts of the world, you'd hear settlers say, look at all we built. And I always look at them and say, you ain't built shit. You see, a lot of these people, a lot of the ideas, a lot of those stuff, the labor, the creativity, all the people you dominate built it. But in that framework, once we get to understand it, think about even the debates today. There are a lot of people who say capitalism, capitalism, but I've always said there's irrefutable proof that social welfare states and socialism work. And people always look at me shocked. What's the proof? And the answer is structural white wealth. Go look up history. There has never been an achievement of creating a white middle class without a social welfare intervention. And those very interventions were blocked. The access to them were blocked from Black, Native American, and brown peoples. So the proof about it is if it were just not looking at race, a whole lot of people have just been in crap without those mechanisms. And in fact, part of the anger today by whites is because the new ruling elites are receding from the race-based model and are just screwing over everybody. And what the whites want is to go back to the license model and say, but it's fine to screw over others, but why us? That is the subtext of what's happening globally, okay? Because simultaneously, while they say they're anti-socialism this, they want socialism and a lot of those things. They just want it for whites, or in some cases, whoever is the dominant ethnic group, okay? Because, as I said, I brought up India as an example, but there are others. It's not exclusively, it's just that in this context, it is based on the notion of white supremacy. But remember, white supremacy and anti-Black racism are not the same thing. You can get rid of white supremacy, and you could still have anti-Black racism. Because you could say, okay, whites are not superior, but man, those Black people are inferior. You can maintain it. So it's a double-pronged struggle. So if you're going to talk about freedom then, here's the thing. There are a lot of elements when I talk about freedom, but there are two things to consider with freedom, right? One thing with freedom to consider is that for freedom to work, you need to have a home. And a lot of people don't understand this. You can have liberty without a home. Just send you out in the bush, all right? There are people who want to be Mr. Frontier person or whatever, and, right? But that's liberty, that's not freedom, right? And the reason we know this, everybody knows this, right? Think about people who escape from a prison. If you want to find them, just go hang out where their house was or their home. They will try to contact their family. And the reason is, a lot of the things when I'm talking about the philosophical anthropology of what it is to be human, although I talked about relations, I talked about activities that are connected to power and all of those things, human reality needs a home. In fact, we do it in many ways. Art. You know what? The people have all kinds of theories of art, but why the hell do we have art? If we didn't have any art, we could still process nutrition in our body, etc. but we wouldn't have a human existence. Reality, in and of itself, has no reason to give a damn about any one of us. But when we produce art, art produces the symbolic representation of the world in which we live, in which we matter. Everywhere we look around us, we see an expression of human reality. The mistake is people think about high versus low art. They don't realize this beam here is art. This podium is art. Streets. Even when we look at the forests around Durham and so forth, they're not in themselves nature. They're curated. We have produced a world to live in. So an art is an expression of home. Schopenhauer argued this, but there are many others who do too. But it's not just there. It's in our disciplines. Many of you could have studied many things, but those of you excel in the disciplines in which you experience being at home. And it's the same with your partners and friends in life. Relationships establish belonging, and that's a crucial element of freedom. Okay? If you took belonging out, there's a reason why some human beings will walk off of a cliff. But then there's another element, and this is a complex element. This complex element is responsibility. You can have liberty without responsibility. That's what license is. But when one of the difficulties, the reason the adolescent suffers is because the adolescent is entering a world of responsibility. And freedom is about that responsibility. But freedom can have a responsibility over something very specific called power, and that is political responsibility. And so I close with something that's implied in this. And it's implied in it through something many of you have heard about, and this may sound weird to bring it up in this context, but it's called radical love. Now you say, oh man, we were ready for some revolution. Let's go knock the walls down stuff. But here's the thing. When we think about these concepts, we fail to think about something, the implications. So let me start with problematic love. Problematic love, by the way, human reality is narcissistic in the sense that we look for expressions of ourselves. That is actually healthy because that's how we expand the symbolic world. Unhealthy narcissism is when we ignore reality and make ourselves into gods or the reality. When it's all about the self. It's not about other human beings or other living things, okay? Narcissistic love is of this form. I love you. Why? Because you're like me. Then all you are is an analog of me. Colonialism is narcissistic love. Colonialism presents itself as benevolent. But I think one of the most brilliant texts on the horror of colonialism is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Because what Victor Frankenstein just means victory over freedom, right? Frankenstein means freedom, victory, right? Or it could mean victorious freedom. But anyway, he looked for the projection of himself and saw the creature looking back, and he didn't like what he saw. Colonialism tries to produce, but it looks back, and the image, the ugliness it sees, it's really itself. We know all these projections on Black people as ugly as crap. That ugliness that they're seeing is themselves. And I think that's what was brilliant about the movie Get Out. Because people always say people hate Black bodies. That's BS. Actually, people love Black bodies. They just don't want Black consciousness in there. The wet dream is for a white consciousness looking back from a Black body. And so if we get into this question of narcissistic love, now we move away. And I want to give an example of a different kind, and this is what I'm going to close with. I want to talk about a woman who exemplifies this issue, and it has profound political implications. Her name was Harriet Bailey. Now, Harriet Bailey was a woman born in the late 18th century, and she was an enslaved woman in Maryland, and she lived into the early 19th century. You already know that enslaved people, women, their children were taken from them as property that belonged to the enslaver. I don't like to say master, say enslaver. And that person was usually left. There's an elderly enslaved woman who would take care of them, and when they're reaching the point where they could do certain kinds of labor, they're brought to the plantations to labor. Well, one of her children was a little boy who was brought to a plantation where she discovered, and this could be documented in other ways by work like Julia Scott, The Common Wind. A lot of people know enslaved people were always fighting and also had a whole network of communication. So she learned, she was a field enslaved person, that her child was 12 miles away from her on another plantation. And the child was 7 years old. So this woman, after working from dawn till dusk, would take what little scrap she had and walk 12 miles to be with that child. And God knows all kinds of stuff she went through. But when she would be with that child, she would share the little food she had. One time she stood up for the child against a cook. And she brought into that child's life something rather interesting. And then she died. This went on for 6 months, and she died. Now, the child was suddenly introduced to something, because commodification of human beings tells that child that, and this was a boy, his value was simply as a commodity for the enslaver. He was to labor or be sold. So value was simply commodity value, right? Economic value. However, suddenly, this woman shows up, and there's a new value brought in. And I could tell you, anybody who's a parent knows this. It doesn't matter if your mother is poor. It doesn't matter if your mother is a slave. It doesn't matter from a child's point of view. If a parent isn't there, there's something wrong with the parent. The child experiences abandonment. And so suddenly the parent, the mother, is there. So that child could not argue abandonment. And I often ask my students, well, what do you think she introduced? And of course, if you experience abandonment, what you say is, my mother didn't love me, even if she couldn't control the circumstances. But now this child has to say, my mother did love me. And that love introduces a new value into that child, because the world says you're only valuable as a thing for a system of enslavement. But now a different value is there, the value of being loved. But it doesn't stop there. Because you see, he could have now become full of himself. He could have looked at the other enslaved children and say, well, you're all commodities, but I'm loved. Right? I'm better than you. But something else happened. This child went on and learned to read and write. It turned out this woman knew how to read and write. He also went on and stood up against a slave breaker by the name of Reverend Covey. He then eventually escaped, got his liberty, but he realized if he just stayed as a fugitive, he would not have his freedom. There are people today who romanticize fugitivity, but fugitives are not free. They have liberty, but not freedom. So he came out and got involved in political struggles. And he began so he's risking re-enslavement. And that is because, at this point, the question for him was linked to this woman. Because you see, you notice I said her name, I didn't say his. Because this is really her story. Because his story, everybody knows. He went and changed his name from Frederick Bailey to Frederick Douglass. Everybody knows Frederick Douglass's story. But what they don't know is why Frederick Douglass, in each of his biographies, autobiographies, his narratives, in the last one, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, put this story to the beginning. And he says the analysis I'm giving here. He said the issue, it is important that his mother loved him, but it was more important that he loved her. Because the society basically dictates that the love of an enslaved woman was not a valuable love. If he values the love of that woman who structurally, the society said, was incapable of giving value, then he has committed a radical act of identification. It means he's not to go and be pat on the head and say, you're a very good orator, you're good, you're not like the other blacks, you're not like that, black exceptionalism stuff. There are people who get into that. No, he has to identify with the enslaved, or what Frantz Fanon called le damné de la terre, the damned of the earth. And it's that moment that made him a revolutionary thinker. Because at that moment, the question of freedom was so intimately linked to the question of radical love that he understood that freedom was not a personal matter. It's a shared political matter. And it's so radical, in fact, that here's the thing. That woman had no reason to believe that child would love her. She died not even knowing it. But similarly, when we do political work, when we fight for freedom, emancipation, transformation, if we do it simply for ourselves, we miss the point. Because when I said those descendants in the beginning of this lecture, those descendants are anonymous. We don't know them. And in fact, a lot of the people like her who fought for us to have a room like this, they had no reason to know us. And so the existential conundrum is, why did they act? Well, they act out of existential political commitment. And that existential commitment is a manifestation of radical love. When you act politically for a world you yourself may not live in, it means you're setting the conditions of possibility for people to be able to live with a freedom that is meaningful for them. It doesn't have to be in your terms. And if you do that, that act of radical love, understood politically, is one in which the generations to come look back and they could only think one thing: thank you. I'm done.
Okay, so we are going to open up for questions.
Please say your name to, I like to address persons with the name.
Thank you. So I'm Olivia.
Hi, Olivia.
Hi. So I guess my question is a little half-baked, but this idea of radical love as being partly right, a kind of gesture towards an epistemological openness, of sort of humanness as epistemological openness, had me thinking about so many examples of the Black women who I work on, mostly Black lesbians, in the context of the HIV and AIDS crisis. So I was like, glad to hear you talk about Audre Lorde. I guess a kind of question that I'm sort of formulating had to do with something at the beginning of your talk, the mentioning the context of idolatry. And in the context of particularly thinking about people like Audre Lorde, I wonder about like this desire to exceptionalize or individualize, or like thinking even, Frederick Douglass as an exceptional figure. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this kind of conundrum of this draw to exceptionalize certain figures, even when, if they're figures such as Audre Lorde, they actually are trying to point us to, they're seeking to point us to the kind of radical love and epistemological openness that's an important part of the kind of freedom that's part of your talk. So how do we manage that kind of will to have a kind of idolatrary relationship to those people, even as their work and the work of people like them is trying to point us in the other direction?
Thank you. That's wonderful. Would somebody else like to ask before I answer? Well, I'll go to that one while you're formulating your question. Yeah, that research, particularly if you look at someone like Renee Teresa White, right, taking risks seriously, right? There's so many people who do work. You notice when I told the story about Harriet Bailey. Some of you, because you're scholars, already knew who she was, but a lot of people don't. And I really kept the identity of Douglas secondary on purpose. The other thing was this woman had every reason to believe her actions didn't matter, right? She was acting without any guarantee of the outcome, okay? And what I was trying to bring up with that, I just brought her up because the reveal is somebody people knows. But if I stopped there, that would have been exactly what you said, the kind of exceptionalism. I had to point out that he had to learn the reason he went to others who were not Harriet Bailey was precisely because part of how the system works to rationalize dehumanization is to make those of us who are able to function the exception and to make those in the dominant group who are not able to function as the exception. So no matter how many blacks there may be who are able to achieve things, we're called exceptions. And no matter how many examples of white failure, we don't look at white structurally as failures. In fact, nobody is really trying to argue that there's something endemically about being white and male and being a serial killer, okay? And part of it is because the humanity of whites is already in there, so people are looking for other variables. The important thing is that the idea of telling the story that way is to ask about how many countless unknown people are connected to us being able to function today. And we have to understand that sometimes when we're doing things that really work, we will be anonymous to generations to come. We're not necessarily named. And that's why I call it radical love, because it's not about knowing the outcome. It's about a commitment in the performance, in the action. And there are times stories may work out certain ways. There are many examples of this. There's so many in existential literature. But in mundane levels, I could tell you just a very quick story. I remembered when I was a secondary school teacher, there was a kid who was a real pain. And I mean, he was obnoxious and so forth. And I thought, oh, good God. But then I somehow figured I'll give a little extra and work with this guy. And I realized he must be insecure. And so I worked with him and so forth. And, and he ended up doing pretty well. And he became an honest student. And I told a funny story at lunch. My youngest brother, he's deceased, but was a really, really good-looking guy. And there was a young woman in the class as well, and she was really, really nasty and mean. And I threw her up by saying, "You should see a picture of my brother." And she said, "Why the hell you show me?" And I took out a picture, and she said, "Oh, God, he's fine." And she started coming to class every day and became an honor student, right? But this other kid, then I went on and went to graduate school, so forth, and there was a family reunion in the Bronx. No, in New York, in the Bronx. And I go, and it's about 150 of my relatives, and that guy shows up. And I'm like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And he says, "Oh, I'm here to see my grandmother." I was like, "Who's your grandmother?" And it turns out his grandmother is my grandmother's sister. Now, again, I wasn't acting from the motive that was a relative of mine. Do you see what I'm getting at? Boy, it would have been bad if I were a sucky teacher. Oh my God. But anyway, but the point is, we don't always know the outcome, and they're not guaranteed. Sometimes we fail. And that woman died with absolutely no knowledge of whether she succeeded. And what's implicit in here is a wider thesis, which is, how do we study failure? When we think of ourselves in a selfish, self-centered way, we think of our individual failure as the story. But there's something many of us don't understand. You see, the structure of oppressive systems are designed for nobody to challenge them. When people challenge them, they have to adjust to suppress them again. But every movement of adjustment leaves another door open. And so many of you may have experienced this. You work with an organization and you have an idea, and there's always somebody says, nah, we tried it. And right? And then you say, well, maybe let's try it now. So you try it now, and it works. And then people are perplexed, and they think it worked because you were special and they were not. That's wrong. That's the substance individualistic way of looking at action. What they didn't realize is when they tried it, they set the conditions from when another generation tried it. They're dealing with different connections to the problem. And so the actual success, which they could not have predicted, is linked over time for the conditions they were setting. Remember I said power is also with access to the conditions. And so if we understand political work, not as a me thing, but as what needs to be done, then we set the groundwork for others. And it doesn't necessarily, this is the challenge. We don't know the outcome before the performance. So we have to act through a commitment for things that need to be done. Disgruntled people, conservative people, pessimistic people say, if I can't do it, it must be because it cannot be done. And that is arrogant. It's, in effect, what we're trying to do, and all I am doing is offering my part. And similarly, Bailey, and it's not only Bailey, I mean, we know more about Harriet Jacobs and those, but there are many others. I could name a lot of people whose names would mean nothing to many of you. If I talk about Beatrice Owen, if I talk about Gertrude Studdard, I could name lots of people. Everybody who does serious historical work see a whole lot of people that nobody. What's beautiful about this book is that a lot of the people she talks about nobody would know. But she's transforming, it's given us a better understanding, because all of those people who were killed and never registered as a homicide, and all of their families who fought, she is bringing into a framework that makes us not only know their stories, but understand what was going on. You see? So yeah, no, thank you so much for that. That's the thing. You hit the nail on the head. We need to find a way to articulate the narrative that don't bring them into the notion of an exceptional individual, but a set of relationships through which, so even Douglas, the way I'm talking about him, is as a relationship that unfolds.
Hi, I'm Veronica.
Hi, Veronica.
I'm a first-year grad student, so I'm learning a lot from what you're saying. And my question's a little bit big, I guess. But as a person who, you mentioned like the 2016 election, person who couldn't vote because of the location she was in, and in that way, I kind of experienced a liberty without freedom. Also, I'm a woman, so it's kind of a controversy right now. Being a woman is having this liberty without freedom. And I consider myself and my fellow people as second-class citizens, because that's how we are classified in the United States. How can I or we as scholars work into a future of liberty and freedom for these second-class citizens, not only my people, but the people who are considered second-class citizens here in the United States? And I mean this like in a general way. How do we work into creating that future in which they say thank you as you finish your speech?
Thank you, Veronica, for that question. You know, do you remember in the beginning I said that I'm against nation states? So one of the things that we're to do in terms of intellectuals, academics, we're not only the people who are to present truth, but we're people who also, all human beings have imagination, but we have a level of suspended exigency that enable us to devote more time to imagination. That's how we develop theory. And a lot of what we develop are things that people may say wouldn't work, would be impossible, like the way I talked about failure. But as we know, when we set the conditions and more people begin to work at it, we build that. One of the things, even before the Dobbs decision, I wrote about is that, you see, one of the things we're dealing with is a thing called lawfare. Lawfare is the use of legal instruments for the sake of undermining the freedom of others. Okay? And lawfare has techniques. It constructs slurs. For instance, one example of lawfare was to make the word liberal into a slur, to use identity politics as a slur. I hate the expression identity politics because they're not really talking about politics. It's a moralistic category that's used to say, I will not listen to you. All right? That's the purpose of the slurs. Critical race theory is being made into a slur for that reason. Well, similarly, if you think about what Jim Crow was, it was the use of legal instruments to make living an everyday life a liability as a black person. Because it was such a vast network of infractions that it was impossible to go through a day without in some way violating a law. And when that happens, you have now constructed a category of illegal people. And the analog I used to use was that is exactly what happens when abortion is illegal. Because it creates a situation in which to live as a woman is to be under the constant threat of a violation of law. And in that category, you begin to produce illicit beings. You see? And the point I made about the nation state is similar. If you had no nation states, as an example, okay? If there were global federalism, where there's nowhere a human, then you would have eradicated the category of illegal people. There will be nowhere on the planet anybody could go and be illegal. And think about that. It would mean you won't have refugees, because if something's bad in one place, you just go to another. It will change wages, because if you cannot make employment attractive in a place, people go to another, which means you have to make it attractive to retain labor. And the list is long. And we could get rid of old mechanisms. Why do we think of presidents and all of that old, monarchical, religious-looking stuff? We can have councils, communities, and bottom-up layers. There's a fellow by the name of Barber who wrote a great book called Cool Cities about how to deal with the environmental issue. So if we come now to this specific issue, one of the things that's happening right now is we're witnessing lawfare. That decision had no genuine legal basis whatsoever. What this is a clear abuse of having a procedural structure that depends on having a certain group of individuals who could dictate their terms. And in faith, we had relied on people to have integrity and character. But within that framework, these individuals have declared war actually on human beings. They're twisting the words. They call a fetus a human being. But the truth is they don't like human beings. Whether it's from death penalties, incarceration, they don't also want people of different sexual orientations. The list is long. And so for them, it's not only women, it is part of the project of the production of illicit people. However, we should not diminish the significance about women, because precisely the very logic of misogyny is linked to a plethora of other values. Naive liberalism says you could pick women up and put them into systems that historically excluded women. The problem is that's based on that old metaphysics. You pick up a substance, you put it, it stays. However, if what was producing women as women and men as men was a set of relations, then what you're doing is bringing someone anatomically female to function in something that's symbolically male. Same thing with race, right? It's to have a person who is black skinned but functioning as white. And so if people are relationships, then belonging requires changing the game. Because you see, if a woman comes in a system that sexualized her, that put her into the category of servant, the list is long, then it's not simply her anatomy that comes in. There's going to be a problem about all those other issues. And this is exactly why, as we become a society that is now attempting to be more demographically diverse, there are all kinds of new legal and political issues emerging because there are things that were considered normal before that are now abnormal. And the people who are trying to turn the clock back want to now return to the normalization of those dehumanizing practices. And they know that gender is a crucial element of it. One thing that I also argue, because I argue relationally, I never look at race by itself. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've never seen a race walking. And I've never seen a gender walking or a class. You see what I'm getting at? And people who are methodologically limited fail to see that we can talk about how they work together. There are people such as Crenshaw, as you know, argue this, but she could go even further if we talk about multidimensionality. Kim Crenshaw never says she's the end-all, be-all on the issue, but she says we need to find a way to bring these elements together. But there are many who argue this. Fanon actually did argue this, and there are lots of others who have as well. So now the concrete political work, we got to get out there and fight, just bluntly. And we got to fight not for ourselves. We have to fight for a better society, all right? Because that's why I brought that part about radical love. Because at the moment, they are being brutal. And we may be a generation who may not see the promised land, so to speak. But there's no promised land that's going to emerge without we in these generations acting. So we got to do what needs to be done. And some cases it's more clear, whether it's changing the locations of power and voting mechanisms in certain communities. But on a more radical level, down the way, we really got to get rid of nation states. And that's already grammatically happening, just not legally happening. It's grammatically happening because how can you really seriously have borders when you have an internet? And how can you really seriously have borders when there's no such thing as a non-permeable border? So we're actually holding on to a way of organizing political power that produces illegal people and a whole plethora of dehumanizing practices. And there's one big issue connected to this that is pretty straightforward. Unless we do this, there is no way we can do a proper intervention into the ecological crisis. There's none. There's no way. We can only, because pollution anywhere can float where pollution doesn't follow borders. Okay? And neither does toxic rain and all of that other stuff. So it has to be a global intervention. I'll try to be short because I know we're running out of time.
It's going to be really short. But I just wanted to ask you to go back to your thinking about power and Black power.
Oh, say your name for everybody.
I'm Esther. I think I know almost everybody.
I know Esther.
I know almost everybody here.
But I was thinking for the camera too.
Hi, Eric. I know Eric too. So I wanted to ask you about what you were saying about the negation of Black power as a negation of access to conditions of power, and specifically human power beyond the physicality. right? So that's sort of this sort of baseline, if I'm quoting you more or less right. And I wanted to then jump ahead, and you talked about things like arts, and you talked about technologies, and I'm following you. And then but I also wanted to ask you, when we get to this idea of relationality, about something like presence that is also embodied presence, that is also about that kind of potential, right? So I got a little lost in the sense that there was something about a two, it was almost like the physicality as opposed to the culture, knowledge, arts, technologies, right? And I wanted to kind of include the physicality or the presence in those as well. Does that question make sense?
It makes total sense. The short answer, which I talk about in Fear of Black Consciousness, I distinguish it between lowercase b black and uppercase b black. Okay? Oppression wants to lock blackness into its exclusive physicality. But phenomenologically, a human being is not pure transcendence or pure physicality. A human being is a relationship between the two. And so the uppercase black consciousness, where you become agents of history, you have to be somewhere. And you can't be somewhere without physicality. In fact, if you had no physicality, you'll be nowhere. And some people really try to imagine complete disembodiment. But if there's complete disembodiment, you can never even say the words there. There can be no knowledge, no ideas. So the question you ask is basically is pointing to the fact that I'm saying a both and. So it's not anti-physicality, it's anti being reduced exclusively to physicality. You could probably guess it's the same way the other way around. It's anti being exclusively reduced to non-physicality. In fact, I argue both are forms of bad faith. In existential phenomenological language, pure facticity, pure transcendence, both are bad faith. Okay. Thank you.